Evolution is change in allele frequencies in a population over generations. Microevolution is that frequency change happening within one still interbreeding population. Macroevolution is the formation of an entirely new species, built up from accumulated microevolution over long time. If a population's allele frequencies stay the same, evolution isn't happening. What's actually measured when studying microevolution is allele and genotype frequency, tracked as P and Q across generations. Micro leads to macro when small shifts pile up generation after generation, especially when a population becomes isolated, until it's genetically too different to interbreed with its ancestors anymore. There are 5 mechanisms that cause microevolution. Mutation is a random DNA error and the only one of the 5 that creates brand new genetic variation, though it's rare enough that on its own it doesn't shift allele frequencies much. Gene flow is the movement of alleles between populations through migrating individuals or gametes, and it decreases genetic differences between populations by mixing their gene pools together, which means low or absent gene flow is actually what allows populations to diverge and potentially speciate. Non-random mating, usually inbreeding, does not change allele frequencies at all. It only reduces the proportion of heterozygotes while increasing homozygotes. Genetic drift is random, chance-based change in allele frequency, and it's strongest in small populations since chance has more relative impact there. Selection is the only one of the 5 mechanisms that produces adaptive change. Natural selection requires 3 things to act on a trait. It has to vary, it has to be heritable, and it has to affect survival or reproduction. Darwin's logic breaks into 3 inferences. Not all offspring survive because of a struggle for resources. Some individuals survive and reproduce more than others because of heritable traits, and because of that, favorable traits increase in frequency across generations. Darwinian fitness is an organism's genetic contribution to the next generation, not physical strength or speed. An important trap here is that acquired traits, like a scar or muscle built from exercise during an individual's life, are not heritable and cannot be acted on by selection no matter how much they help survival, since they die with that individual. There are also 3 common misconceptions worth knowing. Traits don't evolve because an organism needs them, which is the wrong Lamarckian idea, since the right explanation is that some individuals already had the helpful trait by chance and simply survived and reproduced more. Selection has real limits, since a population can't evolve a trait if the genes for it were never present, and not every adaptive-looking change is evolution, since something like a horse growing a thicker winter coat is acclimatization, a reversible individual response, not a shift in the population's gene frequencies. Sexual selection favors traits that increase mating success, even when those same traits actively hurt survival, because the asymmetry of sex means males typically benefit most from maximizing the number of matings while females typically benefit most from maximizing the quality of their offspring. Intrasexual selection is competition between members of the same sex, where the winner of a direct contest decides who mates. Intersexual selection is one sex actively choosing a mate based on a trait, with no physical competition deciding the outcome. When a scenario has both some contact between males and a female evaluating them, ask what actually determined the mating outcome, the fight or the choice, since that's what decides which mechanism applies. The results of sexual selection are exaggerated traits, like a peacock's tail, that persist across generations despite hurting survival, because the boost to mating success outweighs the cost. Directional selection shifts a population toward one extreme, so the population ends up looking like one thing. Stabilizing selection favors the middle or average phenotype and selects against both extremes, so the population squeezes toward the average. Disruptive selection favors both extremes and selects against the middle, so the population splits into 2 groups and overall variation increases. The words extreme and middle showing up in a question tell you nothing by themselves. What matters is tracing which group is actually thriving and which is being selected against. If the middle is thriving while both extremes struggle, that's stabilizing. If both extremes thrive while the middle struggles, that's disruptive. If the whole population just shifts toward one side with no splitting, that's directional. And if the average itself is shifting over time rather than staying fixed, that's also directional rather than stabilizing. Mutations matter because they are the only source of brand new genetic variation for the other 4 mechanisms to act on, even though any individual mutation is rare enough that it doesn't shift allele frequency much on its own. Whether a mutation is harmful or beneficial isn't fixed. It depends entirely on the environment, which is exactly what happened with DDT-resistant flies, where the resistance mutation was harmful before DDT use, became beneficial once DDT was widespread, and went back to being harmful again once DDT was banned. Genetic drift is strongest in small populations. The bottleneck effect is when a population crashes drastically while staying in the same location, leaving survivors with a randomly reduced slice of the original genetic diversity, like cheetahs today having less than 1% genetic variation from a historical population crash. The founder effect is when a small group of individuals leaves to establish a brand new population somewhere else, carrying only whatever limited genetic sample that small group happened to have. A single scenario can actually contain both events in sequence. A population crashing in place and then a small group later leaving that crashed population to found a new one elsewhere. The biological species concept defines a species as a population that that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring in nature, and its main limitations are that it can't be applied to asexual organisms, which don't interbreed at all, or to fossils. Since interbreeding ability can't be tested in extinct organisms, the morphological species concept classifies by physical appearance, and its weakness is that normal variation within one species can be mistaken for separate species. The ecological species concept classifies by niche or ecological role, and the genetic species concept classifies by DNA relatedness, and both of these are limited by being fairly subjective, since there's no clear line for how different is different enough. When a question describes several details at once, focus on what kind of evidence the biologist is actually using to classify the organisms, since that tells you which concept is in play regardless of other details mentioned. Speciation happens in two ways. Allopatric speciation requires a physical or geographic barrier separating populations, whether that's a mountain, river, ocean, or canyon, and even a newly formed barrier still counts as allopatric. Sympatric speciation happens with no physical barrier at all, in the same location, caused either by internal chromosomal events like polyploidy or by external ecological and behavioral divergence, like a subgroup shifting its diet or mating time while still living in the same area as everyone else. Reproductive isolating mechanisms matter because they prevent interbreeding, which is what makes a species split permanent instead of something that could reverse if the two groups ever came back into contact. Prezygotic mechanisms stop mating or fertilization from happening at all, and include habitat isolation, temporal isolation, behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, and gametic isolation. Postzygotic mechanisms happen after fertilization succeeds, and include reduced hybrid viability, where the hybrid has a lower chance of surviving, reduced hybrid fertility, where the hybrid survives but can't reproduce itself, and hybrid breakdown, where the hybrid is fine and fertile but its own offspring show problems. Mechanical isolation is a physical structure mismatch that prevents mating from succeeding, while gametic isolation is a chemical incompatibility between sperm and egg even though physical contact happens fine. Behavioral isolation means the animals don't recognize each other as potential mates at all, while mechanical isolation means they do attempt to mate but physically can't align. Reduced hybrid fertility means the problem shows up immediately in the hybrid itself, while hybrid breakdown means the hybrid is fine and the problem only shows up one generation later in its own offspring. A hybrid zone is a region where two species overlap and interbreed. Reinforcement happens when hybrids are less fit, which causes isolating mechanisms to strengthen and interbreeding to decrease over time. Fusion happens when hybrids are just as fit, causing interbreeding to increase until the two species merge into one. Stability is when nothing changes. The hybrid zone just persists the same way over time. The one question to ask is whether there's a trend happening at all, and if so, whether hybrids are doing worse or fine. Gradualism is the idea that evolution happens slowly and continuously, which would show up in the fossil record as many transitional fossils documenting smooth change. Punctuated equilibrium is long periods of little change interrupted by short bursts of rapid change, which would show up as long stasis followed by an abrupt shift with very few transitional fossils in between. Adaptive radiation is the rapid diversification of one ancestral species into many new species, and it happens when that species colonizes a new habitat with very little competition, allowing rapid diversification into open ecological niches. The final step of this process is character displacement, where the newly diversified species evolve different traits specifically to reduce competition with each other, as seen in Darwin's finches. Ecology. A population is a group of individuals of the same species in one area. A community is all the different species living together in that area, without reference to the physical environment. An ecosystem is that community plus its abiotic components like soil, water, and climate. Dispersion patterns describe how individuals are spaced. Clump dispersion is caused by uneven resources and is the most common pattern in nature. Uniform dispersion comes from strong interactions like territoriality or resource competition, and results in even spacing. Random dispersion happens when individuals don't interact strongly with each other, and it's actually uncommon in nature, not the default pattern people sometimes assume. Population size is driven by births and immigration increasing it, and deaths and emigration decreasing it. Life history is how an organism allocates its resources between growth, reproduction, and survival. Semelparity is reproducing once and then dying, like salmon, while heteroparity is reproducing repeatedly over a lifetime, like elephants. The three survivorship curves differ by when mortality is concentrated. Type 1 shows mortality concentrated late in life, typical of species like humans with few offspring and heavy parental care. Type 2 shows a constant death rate at every age, seen in some birds and rodents. Type 3 shows high mortality while young, followed by good survival for whoever makes it past that point, typical of species like fish and insects with huge numbers of offspring and no parental care. The defining factor is always when death happens, not just offspring number or care level by themselves, since a scenario can mention details like some parental care as a distraction from the real pattern. There are a few important trade-offs in population ecology. Quantity versus quality of offspring is the trade-off between number of offspring and how much investment goes into each one. usually compared within a single reproductive event. Current versus future reproduction is a trade-off across time, where reproducing heavily now leaves less capacity for reproducing later in the same population. The general trade-off between reproduction and growth is about how an organism divides its energy between reproducing and growing within the same time period. Telling these apart comes down to asking whether the comparison spans different time periods or the same one, and whether it's about offspring number versus investment or about reproducing versus growing. Exponential growth produces a J-shaped curve, following the formula change in n over change in t equals r times n, with no carrying capacity term in it, and it's density independent since unlimited resources mean crowding doesn't slow it down, as seen in bacteria growing in fresh nutrient broth. Logistic growth produces an S-shaped curve, following a formula that does include carrying capacity, and it's density dependent since growth slows as resources become limited and the population approaches its ceiling, as seen in something like paramecium in a lab dish with fixed food. A quick way to tell the formulas apart is that if it has a K in it, it's logistic, and if it doesn't, it's exponential. Carrying capacity itself is the maximum population size an environment can sustain long-term based on its available resources, and it isn't necessarily fixed forever if resource availability changes. Density-dependent factors get worse as a population becomes more crowded and are usually biotic, like disease, competition, or predation, since these need proximity or contact between individuals to intensify. Density-independent factors affect a population the same way regardless of crowding and are usually abiotic, like fire, storms, or drought, since these hit an entire area at once without spreading from individual to individual. The reliable test is asking whether the factor's effect would get worse if the population were more crowded, and if the answer is yes, it's density dependent, and if no, it's density independent. Our selected organisms are small, develop fast, are short-lived, produce many small offspring with little to no parental care, and tend to thrive in unstable environments, like insects. K-selected organisms are large, develop slowly, are long-lived, produce few offspring with heavy parental investment, and tend to maintain population sizes close to carrying capacity in stable environments, like elephants. The current world population is approximately 8.2 billion, and exponential human population growth began in the 1800s. Driven by the Industrial Revolution and improved healthcare. A wide-based pyramid age structure diagram indicates rapid population growth. An upside-down pyramid, narrow at the base and wide at the top, indicates negative or shrinking growth. A rectangle shape, roughly even across all ages, indicates a stable population with zero net growth, not rapid growth, which is a common point of confusion. Ecological footprint is the amount of land and resources a lifestyle requires, expressed as the number of Earths that would be needed if everyone lived that way, and more resource-intensive lifestyles, with more cars, bigger homes, and more meat consumption, produce a larger footprint. Species interactions come in several types. Commensalism is when one species benefits while the other is truly unaffected, like barnacles riding on a whale. Mutualism is when both species benefit, like bees and flowers. Parasitism is when the parasite benefits while the host is harmed but usually not killed, like a tapeworm. Predation is when a predator kills and eats its prey. Competition is when both species are harmed while competing for the same limited resource. Herbivory is when an animal eats a plant, benefiting itself while harming the plant. The key distinction between commensalism and parasitism is whether the other species is truly unaffected or actually harmed even slightly. Predation regulates prey populations and drives the evolution of defenses. Camouflage means blending into the physical environment. Aposematism is bright warning coloration signaling toxicity or danger. Mimicry means copying the appearance of another species rather than the environment itself. Physical defenses include things like spines, shells, or speed. Patrician mimicry is when a harmless species mimics a dangerous one purely as a bluff, while Mullerian mimicry is when two or more genuinely dangerous species mimic each other, reinforcing a shared warning signal. Coevolution is when two species reciprocally drive each other's evolution over time, like a predator and prey locked in an ongoing arms race. The competitive exclusion principle states that two species competing for the exact same limiting resource cannot coexist indefinitely, and species get around this through resource partitioning or character displacement, which reduce the overlap between them. The fundamental niche is the full range of resources a species could use with no competition present, while the realized niche is the narrower range it actually uses once competition is factored in, and the realized niche can never be larger than the fundamental one. A common trap involves removal experiments, where removing a competitor lets a species expand its observed range, but this doesn't mean its fundamental niche grew, since the fundamental niche was always that large. It's only the realized niche that expands to finally match it. Resource partitioning is species dividing up how they use a shared resource, through behavior or timing, without any physical trait changing, while character displacement is an actual physical trait diverging specifically in the areas where two species overlap. A keystone species has a disproportionately large effect on its community relative to how abundant it actually is, like sea otters controlling urchin populations to protect kelp forests. Resistance is a community's ability to not change at all when disturbed. while resiliency is its ability to recover after being disturbed, and these are independent properties that don't necessarily go together. Species richness is simply the number of species present. Evenness is how balanced their population sizes are relative to each other, and diversity combines both, with the most stable communities showing high richness and high evenness together. Succession is the predictable, gradual change in a community's structure over time. Primary succession starts on lifeless substrate with no soil at all, like bare rock after a volcanic eruption, and proceeds slowly. Secondary succession starts where soil already remains after a disturbance, like a fire, and proceeds faster since soil doesn't need to form from scratch. A climax community is the final, stable stage that succession eventually reaches. A trophic chain moves from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer, and it's important to count every single step from the producer rather than assuming a chain always stops at tertiary. Since longer chains with quaternary consumers do exist, a trophic web links together all the food chains in a community. Since many organisms occupy multiple trophic levels depending on what they're eating at a given time, primary productivity is the rate at which producers convert sunlight into organic matter, and it sets the total energy budget available to the entire food web built on top of it. The energy pyramid narrows because only about 10% of energy transfers from one trophic level to the next, with the rest lost to heat and respiration, meaning each level up you divide by 10. And each level back down toward producers you multiply by 10. Biological magnification is the opposite pattern, where toxins become increasingly concentrated at higher trophic levels rather than shrinking, because they accumulate in tissue faster than they're eliminated, and each predator consumes many already contaminated prey over its lifetime. A vegetarian diet is more sustainable because eating plants directly skips a trophic transfer and the roughly 90% energy loss that transfer would otherwise cause. Nutrient cycles differ from energy flow in that energy moves one way and is eventually lost as heat, while nutrients cycle repeatedly between living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. Assimilation is a nutrient being absorbed and actually incorporated into an organism's own tissue, turning it from inorganic to organic form. The full cycle runs from inorganic nutrients in the soil, to assimilation into a living organism's tissue, to that organism dying and becoming detritus, to decomposition breaking it back down into inorganic form again, ready to be assimilated by a new organism. Decomposition limits how fast nutrients can cycle, since nutrients stay locked inside dead tissue until decomposition breaks it down. Decomposition rate depends on abiotic conditions like temperature, oxygen availability, and precipitation, with warmer, wetter, and more oxygen-rich conditions speeding it up. On the type of detritus, since thin, soft material like leaves decomposes faster than thick, dense material like wood, and on the abundance and diversity of detritivores present, since more decomposers and a greater variety of them means faster overall breakdown. Eutrophication happens when excess nitrogen and phosphorus, usually from fertilizer runoff, cause an algae bloom, and when that algae dies, decomposers breaking it down consume most of the water's oxygen, creating a hypoxic environment that suffocates fish and leaves behind a dead zone. The fish die from oxygen depletion caused by decomposer activity, not from direct poisoning by the fertilizer itself. A biome is a large-scale ecological region defined by its climate and dominant vegetation type. Elevation affects biome distribution because climbing higher mimics traveling toward the poles, so a tall mountain near the equator can pass through the same sequence of biomes you'd see traveling from the equator to the Arctic, from tropical rainforest up through temperate forest, boreal forest, tundra, and finally polar ice. The tropical rainforest sits near the equator, has high precipitation and warm temperatures year-round. Nutrient-poor soil since nutrients cycle quickly through living things rather than accumulating in the ground, and the highest plant diversity of any biome, with deforestation as its main threat. The temperate forest sits at mid-latitudes, has moderate precipitation and 4 distinct seasons, richer soil, and deciduous trees that lose their leaves each fall, with seasonal temperature swings as its main challenge. The boreal forest, also called taiga or coniferous forest, sits at high latitudes, has low precipitation with long cold winters and short summers, acidic poor soil, and coniferous trees that keep their needles year-round, with a short growing season as its main challenge. The savanna, also labeled tropical grassland, sits in tropical and subtropical regions, has seasonal wet and dry periods but stays warm all year round, and supports grasses with scattered trees, requiring adaptations for both drought and fire. The temperate grassland sits at mid-latitude interior regions, actually experiences hot summers and cold winters, has fertile soil, and supports grasses with no trees at all, with conversion to farmland as its main threat. And the key difference from savanna is that temperate grassland gets genuinely cold while savanna stays warm year-round. The desert has very low precipitation and extreme temperature swings between hot days and cold nights, poor sandy soil, and drought-adapted plants like cacti, with water scarcity as its defining challenge. The tundra also has very low precipitation but stays extremely cold overall rather than swinging between hot and cold, has permafrost soil that's permanently frozen, and supports only low-growing mosses, lichens, and small shrubs. with a short growing season and frozen routes as its challenges. And the key difference from desert is that desert is hot while tundra is cold. Even though both are very dry, the Mediterranean biome sits in coastal mid-latitude regions and is the only biome with a reversed precipitation pattern. Wet mild winters and hot dry summers, with moderate soil and shrubby, drought-resistant plants, requiring wildfire adaptation. A biodiversity hotspot is a region with high species richness and high endemism that's currently under significant threat. And while the 25 recognized hotspots contain nearly half of all terrestrial species, they also tend to have higher than average human population growth, which increases the risk to that biodiversity. The top causes of biodiversity loss are habitat loss, like deforestation, invasive species outcompeting natives, and overexploitation, like overfishing or overhunting, alongside pollution and climate change more broadly. And global wildlife populations have fallen by an average of 68% since 1970. Low endemism that's currently under significant threat, and while the 25 recognized hotspots contain nearly half of all terrestrial species, they also tend to have higher than average human population growth, which increases the risk to that biodiversity. The top causes of biodiversity loss are habitat loss, like deforestation, invasive species outcompeting natives, and overexploitation, like overfishing or overhunting, alongside pollution and climate change more broadly. And global wildlife populations have fallen by an average of 68% since 1970. Low